Isolation is often conceived as an external condition, something that happens to us, a state imposed by circumstance or fate. Yet upon closer examination, isolation reveals itself not as a static, fixed reality, but as a psychological and perceptual construct, shaped and sustained by cognitive, linguistic, and emotional mechanisms. From the perspective of quantum psychology, human experience operates much like a quantum system, wherein reality is not fixed, but emergent, dependent on observation, interpretation, and relational dynamics. Isolation, then, is not a fundamental truth of existence, but a collapsible phenomenon, one that manifests when particular elements of perception, language, and cognition align in self-reinforcing ways. Consider a single moment of solitude. One person may experience it as peaceful self-reflection, another as aching loneliness. The difference is not in the external conditions, but in the perceptual structuring of reality, the mental framework that dictates what is seen, what is felt, and what is reinforced. When viewed through this lens, the experience of isolation is revealed to be fluid rather than fixed, probabilistic rather than absolute, interactive rather than imposed. This means that, rather than simply enduring isolation, we have the potential to disrupt it, reinterpret it, and transform it into an experience of connection. To explore this, we will examine 5 interrelated triads, each illustrating a distinct mechanism by which isolation is either reinforced or dissolved. The first, the triad of perceptual isolation, reveals how the very act of focusing on isolation collapses it into reality, reinforcing it through neurolinguistic framing and cognitive biases. The second, the triad of superposition, challenges the idea that isolation is a binary state, showing instead that we exist in a dynamic flux between isolation and connectivity, much like quantum superposition. The third, the triad of entanglement, dismantles the illusion of isolation by revealing the deeper interconnections, both psychological and existential, that persist beneath surface-level perceptions of separateness. The fourth, the triad of self-reinforcing isolation, exposes how isolation perpetuates itself through identity, internal dialogue, and behavior, creating a powerful negative feedback loop. Finally, the triad of reintegrating connection provides a roadmap for disrupting these loops and establishing positive, self-reinforcing cycles that cultivate connection. By understanding how these triads function and interact, we can begin to see isolation for what it is, not an existential condition, but a cognitive construct that can be collapsed, restructured, or transcended. This exploration is not merely theoretical, it provides practical strategies for dismantling isolation at its cognitive roots, allowing for the emergence of a more fluid, interconnected experience of self and reality. Perception shapes reality, and nowhere is this more evident than in the experience of isolation. Like a quantum system collapsing into a fixed state upon observation, isolation is often a product of how we focus our attention. The more we identify with being alone, the more this perception solidifies, reinforcing itself through cognitive and linguistic mechanisms. This triad examines how our own observation, internal narratives, and cognitive biases interact to create a self-reinforcing experience of isolation, one that, paradoxically, we have the power to disrupt. The observer effect posits that when we fixate our attention on isolation, we inadvertently cause it to collapse from a range of possibilities into a singular, concrete experience of loneliness. In quantum terms, our attention plays a role analogous to a measurement device. By concentrating on feelings of isolation, we reduce the field of potential experiences to one that confirms our focus. This isn't to say that isolation is unreal, but rather that its experiential reality is shaped by the dynamics of perception. Language is not a neutral tool. It actively frames and reinforces our experiences. When our internal dialogue and cognitive frames are steeped in the language of solitude or abandonment, they function as a lens that magnifies feelings of isolation. The words we use, whether alone or isolated, carry connotations and expectations that feed back into our neural circuits, reinforcing a state that we might otherwise reinterpret as momentary or situational. every individual operates within a reality tunnel, a personalized construction of the world shaped by past experiences, cultural influences, and selective attention. When confirmation bias is at work, this tunnel becomes narrower, selectively filtering experiences that affirm our preconceptions of isolation, while ignoring evidence of connection. This selective attention creates a positive feedback loop. The more we perceive isolation, the more our mental filters exclude the possibility of connection. When these three elements interact, a potent feedback loop is established. The observer effect sets the stage by collapsing a wide field of potential experiences into the narrow experience of isolation. Neuro-linguistic reinforcement then provides the narrative and emotional support for this experience, while confirmation bias solidifies the tunnel through which all future perceptions are filtered. The emergent phenomenon is a self-sustaining state in which isolation is not just experienced, but actively produced and reinforced by our cognitive architecture. To negate this cycle, the strategy is to decollapse the system. This can be achieved by consciously shifting language and reframing cognitive focus. For instance, replacing a rigid "I am isolated" with a more fluid "I am experiencing a moment of solitude" opens the door to the recognition of alternative possibilities. By expanding our reality tunnel to include experiences of connection, whether through mindful observation, social engagement, or therapeutic dialogue, we can interrupt the feedback loop and invite a broader field of interconnected experiences. Isolation is rarely an absolute state. It is a fluid, shifting experience that oscillates between separation and connection. Much like a quantum system in superposition, where multiple states coexist until observation collapses them into a single reality, our experience of isolation depends on how we define and engage with it. This triad explores how the potential for connection always exists beneath the surface, how the act of labeling ourselves as isolated solidifies our disconnection, and how our identity remains in a dynamic flux between these two states. Understanding this interplay allows us to resist premature conclusions about our separateness and keep the door open for connection. In quantum theory, particles are described by wave functions representing a range of potential states. Analogously, at the fundamental level, each individual carries the inherent potential for connection. The wave state symbolizes the fluid, uncollapsed possibilities inherent in our being. Connection is always available as an undercurrent to our existence, even if not immediately apparent. The moment we label ourselves as isolated, we force the quantum-like potential into a fixed state, much like the collapse of a wave function into a particle. This perceived separation is a definitive state, wherein the myriad possibilities are reduced to a singular narrative of disconnection. The act of identifying with isolation is a cognitive measurement that forces a fixed interpretation, closing off the broader spectrum of potential connectivity. Our identity is not a binary construct. Instead, it exists in a superposition where feelings of isolation and connection coexist. The oscillation between these states is fluid, dependent on where our attention rests and how we interpret our experiences. In this view, we are never entirely isolated or completely connected. Rather, our identity is a dynamic interplay of these possibilities. The fluctuation is an inherent quality of our psychological landscape, an oscillation that reflects both our vulnerabilities and our potential for connection. The interplay between these elements creates a dynamic system where the state of isolation is always contingent and reversible. The wave state of potential connectivity reminds us that even when we feel isolated, there is always an underlying capacity for connection. The collapse into the particle state is not an irreversible fate, but a momentary condition that can be shifted through conscious awareness. The superposition of identity highlights that our experiences are not mutually exclusive. They are interwoven possibilities that emerge based on our focus and interpretation. To shift away from the fixed state of isolation, one must recognize and embrace the inherent fluidity of identity. Techniques such as mindfulness, which help one observe the oscillation of states without immediately collapsing them into a fixed narrative, can be powerful. By fostering an awareness that connection is always present as a potential, even when not immediately manifest, we can resist the collapse into a singular experience of loneliness. In practical terms, this might involve engaging in practices that expand our attention to include the subtle signals of connectivity around us, thereby preserving the superpositional nature of our identity and opening pathways toward reintegration. Even when we feel alone, we are never truly disconnected. Beneath the surface of perceived isolation lies a web of psychological, emotional, and existential entanglements, hidden threads of connection that persist regardless of distance or circumstance. Like quantum entanglement, where particles remain linked despite vast separations, human consciousness is interwoven in ways the ego often fails to perceive. This triad reveals how our past relationships, collective experiences, and deeper awareness of non-local consciousness counteract the illusion of isolation, offering a more expansive view of our interconnected nature. Entanglement, a core concept in quantum mechanics, suggests that particles remain interconnected regardless of physical distance. In the psychological realm, our past experiences, relationships, and collective memories create intricate webs of entanglement that bind us together. Even when we feel isolated, our emotional and psychological histories maintain an underlying connection to others. These bonds, formed through shared experiences and mutual influences, ensure that isolation is never absolute. It is always counterbalanced by an unseen network of interdependence. The ego functions as a filter that interprets and simplifies our complex experiences. In doing so, it tends to collapse the rich tapestry of entanglement into a singular narrative of individuality and separateness. The ego's role is to provide a coherent sense of self, but in this process, it often obscures the deeper, non-local connections that define our true nature. By filtering out the signals of interconnectedness, the ego inadvertently reinforces the illusion of isolation. Non-local consciousness refers to the idea that our awareness is not confined to the boundaries of our individual selves, but is part of a larger, interconnected field. This broader consciousness encompasses not only personal experience, but also a collective, universal awareness. When we recognize that our consciousness extends beyond the limited confines of our ego, the illusion of isolation begins to dissolve. In this view, isolation is merely a localized phenomenon, a temporary misperception rather than a fundamental truth. The interaction among these elements produces an emergent understanding that isolation is not an existential state but a perceptual error. Psychological and emotional entanglement reminds us that our lives are woven together in myriad ways, even if the everyday experience of isolation obscures these connections. The ego, by collapsing this complexity into a simplified self-image, perpetuates the illusion. However, the presence of non-local consciousness offers a corrective lens, an invitation to see beyond the apparent boundaries and rediscover the interconnected field from which we all emerge. To disrupt the illusion of isolation, one must engage in practices that widen the scope of awareness beyond the ego's narrow filters. Meditation, reflective journaling, and deep interpersonal exchanges can help unveil the hidden entanglements that bind us. By consciously acknowledging our interconnectedness, both with those close to us and within the broader tapestry of collective human experience, we begin to dismantle the narrative of separateness. The key is to shift from a perspective of isolation to one of holistic awareness, where the boundaries of the self are recognized as permeable and transient. This shift not only alleviates the feeling of isolation but also opens up avenues for richer, more integrated experiences of connection. Isolation is not just something we experience. It is something we sustain, often without realizing it. Once we identify as isolated, this perception takes root, shaping our internal dialogue and reinforcing behaviors that deepen our disconnection. Like a negative feedback loop, each element strengthens the others, creating a self-perpetuating cycle that makes escape feel increasingly difficult. This triad examines how the identification with isolation, the reinforcement of this narrative through internal dialogue, and the resulting withdrawal from connection form a closed system, one that must be actively disrupted to break free. The first step in this feedback loop is the identification with isolation. When individuals define themselves primarily by their loneliness or disconnection, This self-definition becomes a core part of their identity. This identification acts as a lens through which all experiences are filtered, making it difficult to see beyond the confines of isolation. In this state, isolation is no longer an occasional feeling but a defining characteristic that colors every interaction and experience. Once isolation is woven into one's identity, internal dialogue reinforces it. Negative self-talk, rumination, and the constant reiteration of a solitary identity create a mental environment in which isolation is continuously validated. This internal dialogue is not passive. It actively shapes neural pathways, making the experience of loneliness more pronounced and habitual. Each thought that reaffirms the notion of being alone strengthens the feedback loop, deepening the emotional and cognitive investment in isolation. The final component of this triad is behavioral withdrawal. As the internal narrative of isolation solidifies, individuals are more likely to withdraw from social interactions and opportunities for connection. This withdrawal not only isolates them further but also creates an echo chamber where the only available inputs are those that confirm their state of disconnection. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Isolation begets negative thought patterns, which in turn lead to behaviors that deepen the isolation. The interplay among these elements results in a negative feedback loop that perpetuates isolation. The identification with isolation sets the stage for an internal narrative that constantly reaffirms this state. This narrative, through relentless self-reinforcement, creates a behavioral pattern of withdrawal, which then provides further evidence, both internally and externally, that isolation is the norm. The emergent phenomenon is a deeply entrenched sense of disconnection that seems self-validating and nearly inescapable. Breaking this cycle requires targeted interventions that address each component of the feedback loop. Cognitive behavioral strategies can help individuals challenge and reframe the negative internal dialogue, reducing the identification with isolation. Engaging in social or community-based activities, even when initially uncomfortable, can gradually counteract behavioral withdrawal. By introducing alternative narratives of connection and belonging, one can begin to replace the old patterns with new, healthier cycles of interaction. Mindfulness practices, for instance, help individuals recognize the automatic nature of these thoughts and behaviors, providing the space to choose more adaptive responses. In essence, by interrupting even one link in the chain, be it the thought patterns, the self-identification, or the behavioral withdrawal, the overall system can be disrupted, paving the way for reintegration and the emergence of connectedness. Just as isolation reinforces itself, so too can connection, when properly cultivated. The process of reintegration does not happen passively. It requires a deliberate shift in awareness, language, and action. This triad explores how recognizing our fundamental interconnectedness, reframing our internal narratives, and actively participating in the world create a positive feedback loop that strengthens and expands our sense of connection. By engaging these elements, we don't just disrupt isolation, we replace it with an emergent experience of belonging that becomes self-sustaining over time. The first element is cultivating an awareness of non-locality, the understanding that our existence and consciousness extend beyond our physical boundaries. This recognition shifts the focus from a narrow, isolated self to a broader, interconnected field of experience. By embracing the idea that connection is always present, even if not immediately apparent, we open ourselves to the possibility of re-engagement with the world around us. Cognitive and linguistic reframing involves consciously altering the internal narrative that defines our experiences. Instead of defaulting to language that reinforces isolation, one can adopt phrases that acknowledge the transient nature of solitude. This reframing helps to challenge the rigid identity of isolation, replacing it with a more flexible and open-ended understanding of one's state. The language we use can reshape our neural pathways, gradually diminishing the power of the old, self-limiting narrative. The final component of this triad is the notion of participatory reality, the active engagement with life's experiences as a co-creator of reality. When we participate fully in the world, through social interactions, creative endeavors, or mindful engagement, we reinforce the idea that connection is not merely an abstract possibility, but a tangible, lived experience. This active participation challenges the passive acceptance of isolation, transforming it into an opportunity for growth, discovery, and mutual influence. Together, these elements form a positive feedback loop that actively counters isolation. Awareness of non-locality serves as the conceptual foundation, reminding us that we are never truly separate. Cognitive and linguistic reframing then provides the practical tools to alter our internal narrative, while participatory reality ensures that these new perspectives are continually reinforced by lived experience. The emergent result is a dynamic state of connection where each positive interaction serves to deepen our sense of belonging and interdependence. To enact this reintegrating model, it is essential to adopt practices that consistently reinforce each element of the triad. Mindfulness and meditation can heighten awareness of non-locality by fostering a sense of being part of a larger whole. Simultaneously, therapeutic or self-reflective practices can help shift internal dialogue toward more affirming language, while deliberate efforts to engage in community and creative activities build a participatory reality. Over time, this positive loop not only counteracts the feedback cycles that sustain isolation, but also transforms the overall experience of self, shifting from one defined by disconnection to one enriched by continuous evolving connectivity. Our journey through the quantum psychology of isolation has revealed a profound insight. Isolation is not a fixed state but a collapsible construct, shaped by perception, language, and cognitive structures. More importantly, just as certain feedback loops reinforce isolation, they can also be disrupted and even reversed to cultivate connection. The key lies in understanding that we are not passive subjects of isolation, but active participants in the reality we experience. By shifting the mechanisms that sustain isolation, we can collapse disconnection and reconstitute the experience of belonging. Disrupting the illusion of isolation begins by recognizing that it is just that, an illusion, held in place by the way we observe and interpret our reality. Much like a quantum wave function that collapses under measurement, isolation only solidifies when we fixate on it, reinforcing the perception that we are separate from the world around us. But just as we can collapse isolation into experience, we can also refuse to measure it in the same way, allowing for the re-expansion of possibilities. Reframing our internal language shifts the narrative, expanding our awareness beyond immediate self-perceptions, reveals the underlying currents of connection that were always present. When we stop defining ourselves by solitude and instead embrace the fluidity of identity, isolation ceases to be a prison and becomes a passing ripple in the vast ocean of experience. Yet, disruption alone is not enough. Left in a void, the mind will return to familiar structures unless new ones take their place. This is where reintegration emerges, not as a forced effort but as a natural unfolding, much like the way a river carves a path toward the sea. Awareness of non-locality reminds us that we are always in some way connected, whether through memory, relationships, or the deeper fabric of consciousness itself. By reshaping our internal dialogue, we reinforce not isolation but belonging, reconfiguring the way we experience ourselves in relation to others. And through action, through stepping into participatory reality, engaging with life, contributing to something greater than ourselves, we anchor connection into lived experience, making it not just a concept but a felt and embodied truth. What emerges from this process is something greater than the sum of its parts. By dissolving isolation's grip and cultivating connection, we do more than change an internal state. We change the field of reality itself. Just as in quantum entanglement, where two particles remain connected across vast distances, so too does consciousness remain woven into an intricate web, unseen but ever present. The moment we acknowledge this, we cease to be lone observers, peering out from a state of separation. Instead, we become co-creators of a universe where connection is not just possible but inevitable. Ultimately, isolation was never an inescapable truth, only an unnoticed choice. By shifting our perception, engaging in the world, and embracing the fluidity of being, we collapse not loneliness but connection into existence.